It is the latest novel in my my Oxford time travel series, and it's called this right now. It's called The Spanner in the Works, and this is from the very first chapter. So, and I'm not going to explain anything. If you don't, I think you can pick up everything you need to know. It was a bad idea. The moon obviously wasn't up yet. There was no light at all. She couldn't even make out the silhouette of Tintern Abbey against the sky. I should have brought a flashlight, she thought, or a burning torch like Wordsworth would have. Maybe you just should give up and go back, she told herself. But Wordsworth had had to deal with a lot more than darkness to see the Abbey. He'd had to hike or ride or row through miles and miles of wilderness to get there. She could surely go a few yards on a flagstone path. But after tripping twice over an uneven edge of the pavement and nearly falling flat on her face, she decided she'd better stand still and give her eyes a chance to adjust. And after a few minutes, she began to make out the outline of the roofless church, black against the slightly less black sky, and then some stars, and finally the transept door that they'd gone through that afternoon when they toured the church. And keeping one hand on the wall, made it into the transept and then into the nave. At least in here, there wasn't anything to trip over. The rubble from the collapsed roof and the fallen pillars, which had been there in Wordsworth's day, had all been cleared away in late Victorian times. It was too dark to see the grass that carpeted the interior of the church, but she could feel its springiness underfoot, and after a minute she could make out the arches of the windows which lined the nave, and then the rose window to the west. But if she wanted to see the moon rise, she needed to be looking east toward the arched chancel window. She accordingly turned around and faced its barely visible outline. There was no sign of the moon yet, not even a glow over the wooded hills, and she had no idea when there would be. She wished she'd checked to see what time moonrise was. She had a feeling it should be up by now. It was getting chilly. A cold breeze was blowing in through the open windows. She rubbed her arms, wishing she'd brought her coat. I need to find a warm corner, she thought, and a place to sit down, like Dorothy Wordsworth. Wordsworth's sister had written that she'd sat a long time in a deep niche and watched the moon. Where would that have been? In the chancel or one of the aisles? Brooke tried to recall any niches from their tour this afternoon, but all she could remember was the herds of uniformed English school children running around the place, and Miss Fisher complaining to Miss Ernwald that they should have gone to Virginia Woolf's house in Sussex instead. Wordsworth has nothing to say to our era, she had said. He's obsolete. We could have seen Woolf's house and then gone to Bloomsbury to see where she wrote Miss Dalloway. Or to the ooze to see where she filled her pockets with rocks and drowned herself, Brooke had thought, probably because of people like you. This afternoon, Brooke hadn't noticed any place to sit in the church, but there must be one, unless Dorothy had sat on one of those broken pillars the Victorians had since removed. No, she'd set a niche, which meant it had to be in one of the corners at the side of the chancel, maybe. There was nothing there, but just inside the entryway to the south transept was a stone bench, and it was near enough to the nave that by sitting close to the end of it, she could see the chancel window and the moon when it came up. If she didn't freeze to death first. The bench was out of the wind, but that was all that could be said for it. It was even colder in the transept than it had been out in the nave, and as she sat there, the rough stone she was sitting on seemed to grow harder and damper. This was ridiculous. The moon was never going to come up. It had been a stupid idea. Dorothy Wordsworth had obviously been here at a much warmer time of the year, or the weather had been milder in 1820. Brooke stood up and started out of the entryway to go back to the visitor's center and immediately saw a faint shimmer. There it is, she thought, finally, and stopped, standing just inside, her hand on the cold stone door, watching the pale light framed by the chancel window. It was odd. Some trick of the moonlight made it seem like it was in front of the window instead of outside, and instead of changing from a glow to the rising edge of the moon, the shimmer remained undefined and growing brighter by the minute. Oh no, Miss Fisher had come looking for her with a flashlight. Or worse, it was one of the Abbey's employees making the rounds, and she'd get in trouble for trespassing. But the light was too diffuse for a flashlight, and it flickered like a candle flame. Had someone else had the same idea she'd had and was trying to recreate Dorothy's moonlit experience by bringing a lantern with her? No, it wasn't a lantern. The light was too white, too bright, and it wasn't like a beam. It flared out in all directions, illuminating the chancel and its empty windows, and she couldn't see anyone standing behind it. Maybe it's a trick of the moonlight, reflecting off the stones, she thought. She started to step forward to see when suddenly there was someone there, a young man with blonde hair standing in the middle of the shimmering light. Where did he come from? Brooke wondered and stepped back into the concealing darkness of the niche. The young man was wearing a long tailed coat and breeches and was carrying a book in one hand and a floppy hat in the other. It's the spirit of Wordsworth, Brooke thought irrationally, but he was looking around at the stone walls and windows far too happily to be Wordsworth or a ghost. The shimmer was starting to fade. He stepped forward and looked anxiously back at it. I'd better get going while I can still see, he said, popped his hat on his head, and hurried out of the chancel toward the north door, toward the visitors' center and out of sight. Brooke looked back at the light, which was fading quickly. Even as she did, it gave a final flicker and disappeared. What was that? She thought, and took a tentative step out into the nave, and the shimmer started again. She dived back into the niche and stood there, pressed against the wall, her breath held. It was exactly the same as before, the disembodied shimmer illuminating the walls behind and around it, and then suddenly in its midst, a man. This one had brown hair and glasses and was dressed in jeans and a leather jacket. He was carrying a flashlight, and he didn't look eager or excited. He looked furious. He stepped out of the light the second it began to fade and whispered urgently, Pratt, are you here? Pratt. When there was no answer, he switched on the flashlight and shone it around the chancel. Pratt, he called more loudly, where are you? No answer. Are you there? It's me, Burden. Still no answer, and after a long minute, he crooked his arm and shone the flashlight on it, obviously looking at his watch, and then stepped forward out of the chancel, shining the flashlight on the nave. Brooke pressed herself against the icy stone wall, wishing she'd retreated further into the recess, but was afraid if she moved now, he'd hear her. Pratt, he called, shining the flashlight on the pillars of the north aisle. It's me. Where the bloody hell are you? He swung the flashlight around to the south aisle, to the nave, to the transept door. Brooke flattened herself even further against the wall, trying to keep out of the beam's reach, but he only gave it a passing sweep and then shone the flashlight on the upper walls of the clear story. No, Ivy, he muttered. Bugger. That means it's not 1820, and you've run off somewhere. I've told you 1,000 times, ascertain your bloody temporal location before you leave the drop area. But did you listen? Of course you didn't. He started down the nave, swinging his flashlight in wide sweeps, down the nave to the west end of the church. He strode over to the north side of the nave, shining his flashlight on the grass at its base, and then started back along the north side, shining it on each of the stone window frames, obviously looking for something, which didn't make any sense. The first guy hadn't been anywhere near there. Nevertheless, he found something, not on the ground, but wedged in the tracery of one of the windows. He transferred the flashlight to his left hand, reached through, brought it out, and shone the light on it. It was a piece of paper. The tour schedule, Brooke thought, left behind by someone who put it down to take a picture, or a brochure of the Abbey. Whatever it was, it only seemed to make him angrier. Tintern Abbey, June 10th, 1975. 1975, and now he's out there somewhere causing paradoxes right and left. I knew we shouldn't have let anyone through till we checked for slippage. He folded the piece of paper, jammed it in his pocket, and walked rapidly back up the nave to the transept. All right, he said, stopping to shine the flashlight on the chancel. That's where the altar was, and that's the south transept. He swung the beam of light toward her door. Brooke shrank back into the shadows. The beam swung away, and that's the north transept and the north door and the way to the visitors center. He shone the flashlight impatiently on his watch again, like the white rabbit, Brooke thought, and disappeared through the north door, only to come back a moment later and go back into the chancel. He walked straight to the middle, where the shimmer was, Brooke thought, and stopped, fumbling in his pocket for something. The paper? No, he'd put that in his other pocket. A coin? Something small, anyway. He stooped, placed whatever it was on the ground, straightened, and walked rapidly out of the church, the same way Pratt had gone, switching off his flashlight as he did. Brooke waited a couple of minutes for her eyes to adjust to the darkness again, and then a couple more in case he came back, and then crept out of the niche, remembering at the last minute to retrieve her bag. She felt her way to the door and out into the nave, thinking, I wish I had a flashlight. But she didn't need one, because here, finally, was the moon, rising over the hills to the east, its glow preceding it. And how could she ever have mistaken the shimmer for it? She waited a minute until the glow was brighter, and she was sure neither of the guys was coming back, and then hurried out into the nave and over to the chancel to see what he'd left on the ground there. It wasn't as light in the chancel as the nave. The side walls cut off some of the moon's glow, putting the grassy floor in nearly black shadow, and she couldn't make out what it was the guy had dropped. But she could see the upper part of the chancel, the arched window, and the wall above it, and there was no sign of a door the guys could have come through or anything. A lamp mounted on the wall or a projector or something that could have produced that shimmer. The moon had risen farther, clearing the hill and shining straight into the chancel. She went back to where she thought the second guy had been when he stooped to lay down the coin and peered at the ground, but it still wasn't bright enough to see, even with the moonlight. Wait, there it was. She shifted her bag to her other hand and bent to pick it up. It was a coin, a 50 pence piece, she thought, though she wasn't sure. She still hadn't figured out the British money. She turned it over and was surprised to see that now she could see it clearly. The moon really is bright, she thought, and looked up. It wasn't the moon. It was the shimmer, which had apparently started up again while she was looking at the coin, and which was now all around her. It flared into a blinding brightness. What? She said, and put a hand up to shield her eyes from it. The shimmer grew brighter, completely enveloping her. No, she said. I have to get out of here, she thought, and clutching her bag to her chest, stepped blindly forward into a large room bordered with machines. A dark-skinned man in a lab coat was standing in front of them talking to a red-headed young woman. She had on a lab coat too and was showing him some papers. A buzzer went off and the man looked up. Who are you? He said to Brooke. Who am I? She said, clutching her bag to her. Who are you? So we're off and funny. So